Hello, my name is Farzana Serang, and I'm the Executive Director of CoFED, the Cooperative Food Empowerment Directive. I'm excited to be a part of this video series and share a little bit about equity and what it means for campus community co-ops. CoFED works with 40 campuses nationwide to start co-ops and to strengthen the cooperative movement nationally. We especially do this to encourage access to healthy food by creating food co-ops and also to build thriving, equitable, resilient local economies. And an integral part of that is equity. So I'm really excited to share with you guys our vision and what equity means within the context of co-ops and college campuses. An introduction to equity for campus co-ops is our focus for the presentation today. So what is equity? Equity is the quality of being fair and impartial. There's a little cartoon on the right here that demonstrates the difference between equality and equity. As you can see, equality gives everyone the same resources, but it does not enable them all to have the same outlook. Equity examines each person and thinks about what those individuals' needs are, especially so that they can end up in the same place. The difference between equality and equity is that equity really takes into account the barriers each person faces and works to create pathways that enable them to have equal access to opportunity. One way to think about this is, does everyone have equal access to opportunity? So for example, when I'm setting up a dinner at my house and I've got a young baby coming to dinner, a friend who's diabetic, and somebody who is really, really old, I can't just cook the same thing for everyone. I have to think about what everyone's nutritional needs are and sort of adjust how I create an enjoyable meal for everyone. There's a lot of terms that I'm using, so I want to take some time to also just distinguish terms. Equality, which means everyone having the same rights or the same things, does not equal diversity. Diversity is more about having a mix. And having a mix, diversity, does not always mean inclusion. Inclusion is an effort to really work to think about who is not at the table, who is not in this room, who has the most barriers to entry, and how do we create a way for them to enter the environment. Equality, as you saw in the cartoon, is not the same as equity. In order to have good outcomes, equity really focuses on a few things. One important thing for us is racial justice, which is concerned with having systems that lead to equitable outcomes and opportunities for people of all races. If culture, policies, or structures are leading to racially disproportionate outcomes, they are not addressing the issue of equity. For example, currently there's a huge racial wealth gap, which means while a lot of people are missing access to wealth, it affects communities of color more than other communities, which demonstrate that there's a systemic issue with racial equity. A term that we like to use at CoFED is called equity squared, which is thinking about the different dimensions of equity and how can you double down on equitable outcomes. For example, there's racial equity, there's social equity, and then there's also economic equity. One example that I wanted to lift up is the Aorta Collective. They're a great example of sort of seeing through equitable outcomes and really working towards that. A couple of ways they do this is, first, they're working to be a worker-owned cooperative, which means that they're creating ownership and building wealth. They are also employing a really interesting idea, which is this idea of need-based pay. So think back to the boxes. People have different bills, different responsibilities, and sometimes equal pay might not necessarily be meeting the needs of everyone. So they employ something that they called need-based pay. Really interesting way to think about equity. Another story is about the Mandela Food Co-op located in Oakland, California. It's a Black worker-owned food cooperative that offers a sustainable model for community and economic development. It's a food cooperative located in a community that lacked a grocery store for decades, and it also built Black ownership. So all of the owners here actually live within one block of the food cooperative. The work, especially in African American communities and Black communities, to create cooperatively owned or run and community-centered food systems is something that dates back to the 1960s. As you can see here in the photo, Fannie Lou Hamer founded a pig bank for rural Black communities to build wealth through accessing pigs to breed, raise, and slaughter. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives was started soon after that, and they also create a Black Land Assistance Fund to support Black farmers and to make sure that there's an economic system that supports them to build wealth. I think that the African American leadership of cooperatives in the United States is rich and important to our history, and we're lucky to have a book by Jessica Gordon Nembhard, Collective Courage, which really starts to tell the story of the deep history and roots. Community wealth building is another way to think about cooperatives, and I think it can be a concept that is very familiar and is based on values of cooperation and sharing. And something that I often think about is growing up in a family. We had 12 family members, one house. We sort of didn't have much, and so we were really had to learn how to share. And I think oftentimes communities that lack access to capital or who have hard times are actually really good at solving them. For example, Korean communities have been using lending circles or keys for centuries to leverage communal wealth. And Latina immigrants in San Francisco have also utilized lending circles, and they use them for citizenship, dreamers, and entrepreneurs. I think it's really important to note that cooperatives have this deep history in communities of color and as a mechanism to fight through economic injustice and build equity. There's also a lot of co-op developers now that notice this and are focusing on specifically Latina-owned co-ops. Prospera, formerly Wages, partners with immigrant Latina women to start their own worker-owned businesses, and it creates viable jobs. So oftentimes these are side businesses, right? Someone's selling tamales or something on the side, but imagine the possibility for that love of creating food to be your main salary. And that's what they've been able to do. I've been talking a lot about the history and the general movement of co-ops and some connection between equity. And now I'm going to focus a little bit more on co-ops and campuses and how they work towards equity. Housing co-ops, when they first began, as said by Steve Dubb, were really created to meet the needs of student communities at institutions that were serving first-generation students. So when you think about the history and how they came out of this need of people who for the first time wanted to have affordable housing, and the current future with most of these universities being top tier, inaccessible, very elite, how do we continue to kind of meet that legacy and meet the needs of the most disenfranchised within campus communities? One example of an effort to kind of create a housing co-op that meets the needs of disenfranchised communities is the Oscar Wilde House. They're making strides. This is the nation's first LGBTQIA and queer-themed student cooperative. It's the first of its kind. It's nestled in between sororities and frats, but really came out as a way to create space that didn't exist in the university and really kind of built community. There have also been movements of food cooperatives within the campus community. The University of Maryland has a food cooperative that is 40 years old, and many of these food co-ops were built to meet the needs of students who didn't have good food or healthy food or affordable food. And it's a movement that we're still seeing today, especially in the work that we do. And what often happens is that people notice that they're not eating good food and they want better options. And at the same time, we're learning from national trends that 60% of students at a rural university in Oregon are food insecure. That means they lack access to healthy food or can't afford it at a routine rate. Some schools in New York show 40%, and in Hawaii it's about 20%. But still, when you look at who's the most food insecure, meaning, okay, of all the people that don't have access to food, what group has the most in access to food? It's students of color. And when we think about food co-ops, knowing that and with the vision and the mission to increase access to healthy food, how are we really creating inclusive environments that benefit students of color who are often working 2 jobs, as the statistics show, or who have different demands on their schedules and might have different food preferences. One example of a food co-op making a stride is the Flaming Eggplant at Evergreen College in Olympia. So this is a student-run worker cooperative, and they source from a lot of local vendors. They were also they worked to source locally, and they noticed that some of their food was not reflective of the communities that originally created the food. For example, they had a white-owned business that was making tamales, and they switched because they were cognizant of the sort of like cultural appropriation, and found a Latina-owned business and gave the contract to her instead. They did a similar thing in terms of finding a source for salmon and worked with a local American Indian source so that they could be more local, but also just more appropriate in terms of acknowledging the history of the food within certain communities and making sure that they benefit from that. So I've been talking a lot today about some of the national movements, history, efforts of co-ops. I've also talked a little bit about equity, its definitions, and especially how some campus communities are working through these issues. I have three main challenges that I think this presents. The first one is that diverse co-op and community wealth-building histories have largely been forgotten, erased, and lost. Cannot tell you how excited I was to have that book, Collective Courage, that started to detail some of the history of the cooperative work and collective courage within African American communities in the South. I believe when she first started writing that book, it was to be something that looked at broader, like immigrant, Latino, yet she found so much research within that community that it was enough for a whole book. And that just goes to show that there's so many more stories that we have yet to unfold and include in our understanding. I think that there is also a bit of a divide. I think while we're making strides, there is still the need to create inclusive communities. So what would it be like? Ops didn't have to have separate houses for communities, but if they were more integrated, or how do we create food co-ops that might have like late hours to serve community members that work late? And I think one of the biggest challenges is that what we're talking about is really structural change. And we have to shift the way that we relate to each other as people. We have to be able to understand the structures and systemic institutions behind all of this and change that instantaneously. So it's hard work. And even as I'm doing this presentation, I'm sure I've fumbled a little bit and it's not easy, but the point is to like try and to work towards it and to know it might not be seamless, but there's ways to do it if we are willing to. A really important method for creating equitable outcomes is doing inclusive engagement. So this means being able to be reflective about who is in the space I'm creating and who isn't, and how can I build a space that is more physically and culturally accessible to more people? Do I need to go out in the streets? Does my co-op even reflect the community that I'm hoping will be a part here? Also, how do I show solidarity? For example, the Berkeley Student Food Collective had this great sign up that said like Black Lives Matter. They were in solidarity, they were at the marches, and I think building those connections shows that co-ops are really a part of this larger systemic change and vision, so that everyone has a livelihood where they can be proud of their jobs, where they can feel valued as people, and where they can create systems that are really alternatives to the ones that we know are broken. So lastly, I thought I would throw out a few resources for folks who would like to learn more about how they can create equitable outcomes within their co-ops. First, talk to us. We're always happy to help or point you to people who we think could be really helpful for your efforts. We're also doing a Summer Learning Institute this summer for people who are in food co-ops, so reach out to us. There's also organizations that have been dedicated to this work for decades, such as Policy Link and Race Forward. If you go to their websites, they have these tools. I believe there's an equity toolkit that allows you to look at the demographic information in your neighborhood. It enables you a better understanding of like, okay, who is the most in need of housing in my community? Who is the most in need of food, both in terms of like race, age, gender? And so those can be really important information points for you as you work to create a more equitable environment. And the last one is read, learn, and grow. I really encourage you to read history, engage in these conversations with each other, utilize this wonderful video series that Tessa is putting together with NASCO, and be ready to grow. There's going to be stumbles along the way, but I think if we are all focused on the promise of an equitable world, we will be able to build it. Thanks very much. I hope that was helpful.